This episode is made possible by the generosity of our listeners. Thank you.
Welcome to the Creation Science
for Kids
show. Want to tackle an idea that blows the minds of scientists, professors, and pastors? We're getting to the main message of Proverbs chapter 8, and it starts out with God's relationship with time. Then it's on to the most amazing creation science lab of the 20th century, the explosion of Mount St. Helens, and the Creation Center you can visit nearby. Lastly, it's time to think about an evolutionist puzzle and creationist delight, symbiosis. Praise the Lord. I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart, in the company of the upright, in the congregation. Great are the works of the Lord, studied by all who delight in them. Full of splendor and majesty is his work, and his righteousness endures forever. He has caused his wondrous works to be remembered. The Lord is gracious and merciful. Psalm 111, verses 1 through 4. This is episode 76 of the podcast where we learn about Jesus, our Creator, and his amazing world. Hi, I'm Sherry Fields, your host, and I'm joined today by my co-hosts, Stephen.
Hi.
And Joseph.
Hi.
To follow along with what we're looking at, check out the show notes, creationscience4kids.com/time or 076. And be sure to listen to the end for the punny science joke of the day. So we're back in Proverbs 8, and this is the second in the section on wisdom and creation that made me choose this passage to study out for our podcast. So we're going to read verses 22 and 23. Would you read them for us, please, Stephen?
The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way. Before his works of old, I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, this is a fascinating concept we find here. So, me here is wisdom. We often see this as Jesus Christ because he is the wisdom of God. Of course, in the Hebrew, wisdom is feminine, so it's described as a she through Proverbs, which is kind of odd to think of, but that's because we speak English and we're not used to thinking of objects like tables and ideas as masculine or feminine. So here we have wisdom, and it describes wisdom in what relationship with God?
God possessed it?
Yes. So God, what's possessed mean?
To have it?
Yes. He has it. So that tells us that, or how long has God been wise?
Forever.
Yeah. Always. So the beginning of his way, if you remember, way means someone's path or
lifestyle.
Right. Lifestyle is how, when you look through the Old and New Testament, when you talk about someone's way, you're talking about their mode of life, what we call someone's lifestyle. So God himself has a lifestyle, which is kind of cool. But here's the word that I really wanted to focus in on. Wisdom was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, before the earth, or ever the earth was, it says, or at least from the moment the earth itself was created, which from Genesis 1, when was the earth created?
In the beginning.
Right. The heavens and the earth were the first things in existence, so space and matter. But look at this word here. Stephen, what's that say?
Before.
Right. So before he made anything. Now, there are different ways of looking at this, and most of the people that I've interacted would say, well, as soon as he created the earth, he also instantaneously started time, because time is how we describe the measurement of things happening in sequence. So if there is nothing for something to happen to, there can be no time. And so they would say this before his works of old was from the split second God created the earth. That's when wisdom came into being. But does that really seem likely?
No.
No, because how would God create the earth if he doesn't already have wisdom before he's created it? There's no getting away from this before. And before has to involve time. In order for it to be before, it must come earlier in what we experience as time. So, like I said, this is something that fries professors and pastors' minds. The person that I've heard speak the most compellingly on this, where I listen to his ideas and I say, he has a point, and that's making me think and see things differently than I have before. And I don't think I've understood it all myself. This is really, really complex. But I would recommend for all you big people and anyone who wants to see if they can do some major brain exercises to check out what Pastor Bob Enyart has to say about it. First of all, he points out, and whether you agree with his ideas or not, I think his research is accurate, that Aristotle had the idea that time was something created, that the divine, the God force, would not be involved in time. Was Aristotle a Christian? No. Who was he and when was he?
He was a Greek guy?
Yeah, he was Greek. When?
I don't remember.
Several hundred years before Jesus was born. So it's a very old idea and not at all from a Christian worldview. He was just recognizing that his culture, the Greeks, you think of Greek mythology, they worshipped what?
Gods.
Yeah, all kinds of gods. Pantheon, which we actually get from Greek. A whole suite of gods who do all kinds of things and act very much like very powerful, very dangerous humans.
Yeah.
Aristotle was recognizing that that couldn't be the true divine, the true creator and God. So he set about thinking what the real force behind the natural world would be like. So he didn't get everything wrong, but was he reading the Bible and listening to God to get his ideas? Was he getting it straight from the real God?
No.
No. Did God turn him into a prophet like he did with Jonah and Jeremiah?
No.
No. Will we see him in heaven with Jesus?
No.
No. So that's one of the important things when you're looking at other cultures and even other religions. They can have some true things and some very useful things as they still bear God's image and as they're still looking at what God created. They can have some very wise and helpful things, but there's likely to be a twist. You always have to be very careful about anything that doesn't come straight from God himself. So that is something that automatically puts up my guard when Aristotle is one saying that God is not in time, that time doesn't mean anything to the divine. So, although, like I said, Pastor Enyart's article, and I'll have the link to it, it's at kgov.com/is God outside of time with dashes between each of those words. But the show notes will be easier to find. Here's something that I think Pastor Enyart got right, and I'm going to quote this. Many have been told that time was created by God and that it is not an aspect of his existence. Please consider, though, that time cannot be created. Why not? Because creation means going from non-existence to existence, which itself is a sequence, a before and after. And any before and after sequence requires time. Time, therefore, is a precondition of creating. Thus, time itself cannot be created. So he's making the same point I had. In order for there to be a before, you have to have time. And since we know that God already existed before creation, he didn't pop into existence when the earth was created. That's bizarre and heresy. So that's where he starts from, and then looks at what the Bible has to say about time. There is one thing I do know, and this comes straight from God's revelation, actually the book of Revelation, about time in heaven. Because I have heard people, in chapter 12, you have an angel that comes and stands 1 foot in the sea and 1 on the dry land and raises his hands and says, in the King James, there shall be time no longer. And I have heard pastors preach it. That means in heaven, there will be no time. However, have a look at Revelation 22:2. Joseph, would you read it for me, please?
In the midst of the street of it, and on either side of the river, was there the tree of life, which bare 12 manner of fruits, and yielded her fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations.
Stephen, did you catch where there's time with this tree of life?
No.
Okay, so it has how many kinds of fruit?
12.
12. And when does it bear the fruit?
Every month.
You see that? Month is
Time.
Yes. So I like to call it the Fruit of the Month Club Tree of Life. And personally, I think it's likely that this will be the smallest unit of time we bother with in heaven. Because remember, we have more than all the time in the world for whatever God has assigned us. But to say, hey, let's go and hang out at C.S. Lewis's house in the month of papaya makes perfect sense to me. So we do know that throughout the eternal state, because Revelation 22 is talking about after death has been banished, this is the way it's going to be from then on out without ever ending. There will be a fruit of the month tree that is for the healing of the nations. So time, however it works with God from before, however it works with God right now, definitely continues for us in a very real and normal way with months throughout all of eternity. So, do you still have any brain power left, or is it totally fried?
Yes, maybe.
That sounds fried to me. Okay, now it's on to Mount St. Helens. You learned about Mount St. Helens, haven't you, Stephen? What do you know about it?
It's a volcano and...
It's out in Washington State, so in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And what happened to it? Is it like Mount McKinley that's extinct?
No.
No. What do you know about it, Joseph?
It was dormant. They didn't erupt usually, and then all of a sudden it erupted.
Yeah. So it wasn't quite all of a sudden. There was plenty of warning. They'd had all the people who lived in the area move out, except those who refused to leave. But it had its first major eruption, the big one, on May 18th of 1980, and then it had another smaller eruption, oh boy, I want to say 2 years later. But do you know why it's so special to the creation community? Why it's something that we really enjoy talking about? Do you know?
No.
Okay, so for me, the first thing is God had the major explosion happen on a Sunday when all the loggers in the area who continued to chop down trees as long as they could, even though they knew it was getting dangerous, it exploded on Sunday when they all had the day off. So none of the loggers were killed, and I think that's a huge mercy. God didn't have to allow it to be that way, but He did. As we've seen in other places, He is aware of us and our needs, and so there was no needless human death, which I deeply appreciate. But when it exploded, there was a huge amount of steam involved, so there was all this mud came flowing down the side of the mountain. It used to be a beautiful cone, just about as lovely as Mount Fuji in Japan, which everybody loves to take pictures of and paint and go see because it's just so lovely and symmetrical. Mount St. Helens is not symmetrical anymore. The whole side of it blew out, and all this material came sweeping down the side of the mountain and into Spirit Lake and knocked down all kinds of trees. So what it has allowed us to do as creationists is to see in real time where we saw before, we've seen now after, how geological processes actually can happen when you have something hugely powerful like a volcanic explosion. So we've seen where it laid down sedimentary layers 15 feet thick in a matter of minutes. We've seen what happens to the trees that got uprooted and then ended up in the lake. In fact, I'm going to link in the show notes to the best book on it called Footprints in the Ash, and it is one of the very few books that I believe every family should get a copy of. And if you've got kids that aren't interested in reading yet, then Awesome Science with Noah Justice, they do an episode on Mount St. Helens. For geology, what Mount St. Helens shows us is incredible. It allows us to see that in the real world, in real time, what they claim takes millions of years can actually happen and does actually happen in a matter of minutes, hours, months, or just a couple of years, like with the trees, how they sank with their root balls down as if they had been growing in the lake when they hadn't. They'd actually been uprooted, but just the way they settled. So it's an amazing place to visit. It's also very lovely already, where plants have come back and lots of animals. And for years now, there has been a creation ministry called the Seven Wonders Museum that was started by Lloyd and Doris Anderson. They've had to retire now, and Paul Taylor He worked with Answers in Genesis over in Great Britain and then with Creation Today down in Florida. He and his wife have taken on the Mount St. Helens ministry, and they've renamed it the Mount St. Helens Creation Center. Now, I've been following their ministry for some time, and they had been in a space that they weren't able to stay in. They were briefly at a campground nearby that was owned by Christians. But now they have a new building. Now you can see from this picture, it just opened back in March. It's going to need a lot of work to look like a fancy state-of-the-art where you can learn museum. But they've got their own place and they're already giving speeches. What I love is that they do a lot of tours where they take you on walking tours near the mountain and where you can actually see those sedimentary layers that got laid down by the mudslides and stuff. So a lot of it doesn't actually require a building. But if you have any extra money, and certainly if you have a chance to travel out to Washington State, that is a place that you'll definitely want to go to. Now, the reason I brought this up, and luckily we recorded this just in time, I had seen that they are having a special conference with landmark events where they're going to have on August 20th, so it's just around the corner. It's too soon for any of us listening to get there, but I'm hoping that they do so well, and if we ask that they'll plan something like this every summer. They're going to be taking people around on different tours. They've got several speakers, and it's being put together, like I said, by Landmark Events. They do a good job. Pat Roy's going to be there, which, by the way, guys, he's the one who started the Jonathan Park audio drama series. He's currently doing Creation Quest, which already has, I believe, an album of stories set in the late 1800s that's available. He's also teaching homeschoolers how to podcast and do audio out in Vancouver, Washington. He's going to be there. And it looks like they've got about 5 people speaking at this conference. So it's going to be quite an event. And I really do, like I said, the Grand Canyon is awesome and you can learn a lot. But did we see the Grand Canyon form?
No.
Mount St. Helens has a mini Grand Canyon because, of course, the forces that made it, as big as that volcano was, are minuscule compared to the forces that have been on Earth. And even quite a number of us believe that the Grand Canyon was formed like 100 years or something just after the flood, not directly by the floodwaters. But still, none of us alive were around to see the Grand Canyon form. But the miniature Grand Canyon at Mount St. Helens is younger than your grandparents. That's pretty awesome to say, hey, we are not guessing. There is no guessing in the timeline of when this was created. And that by itself is hugely powerful for our faith. So whether you can get out to Washington State in person, that would be fabulous. If there's any way your family can do that, by all means do so. And the Pacific Northwest is a beautiful place on Earth to visit. Or certainly get a copy of the book and video on Mount St. Helens that I'll list in the show notes. And even online, if you've got internet access, you can find out a lot about why this is such a powerful thing. Now, before we finish up on Mount St. Helens, I heard this from a lady who helps at a creation ministry in Illinois, and she said she heard it directly from the guy this happened to. So unfortunately, he hasn't posted anywhere online, and at this point, I've forgotten the guy's name. But this is what she says he told her about his experience. He was on the geological study for the U.S. government that was watching Mount St. Helens, was seeing the earthquake activity starting to happen, knew it was exploding. He happened to not be on assignment on the side of the mountain because one scientist did die because it was his job to be observing what was happening and he couldn't escape. They couldn't even get a helicopter in to rescue him. But he wasn't on duty that day, so he lived. His wife and mother-in-law were believers, but he was not. He did not think that Jesus and the Bible mattered. But as he studied and as they prayed, watching what had actually happened because of the explosion, 7 years later, he decided that God was trustworthy, that everything he'd heard about, you don't need a God to create, was not true, that Jesus was real. He became a believer and also a young earth creationist because he had recognized that what he was being told by the people talking about millions and billions of years did not line up with what he was actually observing. And through their prayers and through what he was watching, he found Jesus. That's pretty exciting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Now it's time to hear from you. What do you have for us today, Joseph?
Symbiosis. Symbiosis means two living things working together to help each other out.
Okay, now is there an example like in our life, in our human body, we have a symbiotic relationship with something? That'd be a good way to start so we get the idea of what's happening with symbiosis.
A human and a dog.
Okay.
Because if you have a dog and it's really loyal to you, like if you hurt yourself,
right,
and it's with you, it'll either help you out or go get help.
A lot of ladies who live in big cities have a dog. Why?
If something gets stolen, the dog will chase the person who stole
Right. The dog will defend them. So that's something we've been using probably since the flood, since T-Rexes got dangerous. Dogs help defend us. And also, what else do we have? Like the shepherds, what do they do?
They help out with farm.
Right.
Like they help out with your work.
Yes. So we've got a whole number of breeds that are designed to help us with our work. And all of those help us. That's why we keep them. And even some of the pets, a lot of the little old ladies that have their lap dogs, it's because they get cold. So the dog will keep them warm. That's our half of the relationship. We can see how dogs help us in all different ways. They help us feel good. They help us with our work. They help our bodies and our health. And what about the dog?
And we help them out. Like we give them food.
Yep, and medicine and keep them safe and give them companionship. Yeah, so that's a great example of a symbiotic relationship. Okay, so that's where both members benefit. Okay, so you've got a couple of others.
A clownfish and a sea anemone. The clownfish will help protect the anemone from fish that like to eat it.
So the clownfish isn't the only one that can survive with its stinging tentacles?
Yeah.
Okay.
And the anemone helps the clownfish from predators.
Right. What does it do? How does it? Be specific.
It has tentacles, and I think it like touches it somewhere to let it know that it's not a threat.
Oh, the clownfish?
Yeah, the clownfish.
Okay. So how does the anemone keep the clownfish safe, more specifically?
It has tentacles that will zap.
Right, so they're stinging tentacles.
Yeah, they're stinging tentacles that will sting the fish that want to eat.
Right. So bigger fish that would love to have a clownfish lunch, leave it alone because they don't want to get stung by the anemone. Excellent.
And then cleaner fish and different kinds of fish, like sharks. The cleaner fish eat parasites and dead skin. And it helps the fish so that it can not be hurt.
Right. Are cleaner fish big?
No.
No, they kind of have to be small. And where do they clean off a lot of these parasites?
On it.
Have you seen pictures and videos? Okay, so I've seen it. You should watch it. Cleaner fish will clean like a dentist right inside their mouths.
Yeah.
Okay, so the cleaner fish are so small, they would make a single bite meal for the big fish, but the big fish do not swallow them in general because
they don't want to be hurt. Like, they don't want to be in pain because of something that's bothering them.
Right, so the cleaner fish is helping them. Now, this is one of the ones that you found doesn't always go beautifully. Sometimes
the cleaner fish will sometimes try and eat the fish.
Yeah, so it's just taking a little bite, which wouldn't be much fun, but it's not like it's going to kill the big fish. Yeah. And I would imagine every once in a while, the big fish decides, you know what, I actually am so hungry, I'm going to eat this fish now that he's cleaned out my mouth. So that's one of the ones where we can see the world has fallen. And what's awesome about the Christian worldview is we can see both how the cleaner fish and the other fish can be kind to each other and why they would still sometimes be mean to each other, even though they technically should know better. Okay, so what's another example?
So bacteria and cyboquinid.
That sounds good.
Tube worms.
Okay.
So the tube worms, which are down very far.
In the ocean?
Yeah, in the ocean. They can't digest anything.
What can't?
The worm cannot digest anything. So the bacteria, it exposes it to oxygen, or that's called oxidizes. Oxidizes.
What?
The tube worm's food.
Okay. Yeah. And in fact, that's also true for cows, that when they're chewing their cud, it's to make it easier for the bacteria to get to everything, break it down. And also for us. That's why we take probiotics, because the bacteria that live inside of us, we feed them and they help digest our food properly.
Okay.
We're learning more and more how we desperately need healthy bacteria. And when we have to take an antibiotic, which sometimes we have to because they're also bad bacteria and ear infections are awful and things like that. But when we do, then we have to rebuild the healthy bacteria inside of us to help us with our food. Otherwise, our whole health is affected. So that's another symbiotic relationship. Bacteria have symbiotic relationships with all kinds of things. Legumes, like beans and soybeans and things, have little nodes down in their roots that hold, like pouches, that hold bacteria, and that helps fix nitrogen from the air. Because our air is more nitrogen than it is oxygen. Otherwise, every time you had a static spark in the winter, your room would explode. So nitrogen is everywhere, but plants can't use it as fertilizer, and they do need it badly. But the bacteria can pull the nitrogen out and make it so that the legume can use it, which is why farmers will plant soybeans one year and then corn the next, because the soybeans are helping put in nitrogen and the corn is using up the nitrogen. So they keep switching so it doesn't run out. So bacteria are hugely important for symbiosis. All right, you got a couple more examples?
So lichen and fungi.
Mm-hmm.
The fungi, it gets carbohydrates from the lichen by photosynthesis.
Okay, so who's doing the photosynthesis? The fungus?
The
The lichen
lichen.
is the plant part, and the fungus is more like a basic, we would call it an animal kind of form. Okay, so the lichen feeds the fungus bacteria or carbohydrates, and what's the fungus do for it?
The fungus protects it.
Okay, how?
So,
do you know?
not really.
Is the fungus what makes the hard surface of the lichen?
Yes.
Yeah, so lichen, where do we find lichens?
On rocks and stuff.
Yes. So they're small and they're kind of lacy and rather pretty often. But yes, they are always these double form where it's partly plant but partly animal, which is really fascinating to realize. And they help each other out to survive all the way up to the far north. You have lichens will be the only thing, or on the highest mountains, lichens live in places where practically nothing else can. And it's because of that protection. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then a shrimp and a goby fish.
Yeah, I think it's a goby fish.
Goby fish. So the shrimp will dig a hole in the ground where both the shrimp and the goby fish can live.
All right.
But the shrimp is blind. So the goby fish, when there's danger, it'll touch the shrimp on the tail to let it know that there's something that's going to eat you.
So the shrimp is helped by making the home that the fish couldn't dig. And then the fish warns the shrimp, hey, watch out. We got to hide so we don't get eaten. That's cool. I'd not heard about that. Yeah. Okay. Symbiosis is fairly common. It's even more common where one thing benefits and the other doesn't. And then at the bottom of the rung where one thing is using another and it hurts it. Do you remember what that's called?
No.
Where it's a parasite.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And as we're studying more and more about parasites, we often find that it has lost abilities to take care of itself. And that's why it's dependent on the others. That when God first created them, they probably were meant to be a symbiotic relationship, or I'm blocking on the name for where it only goes one way. So at the beginning, I mentioned that symbiosis is an evolutionist puzzle while it's a creationist delight. We can delight in God
having two things work together.
Right, from the very beginning. So it's not a puzzle to us because we look at it and say, okay, back when God made lichen on day 3, most likely, he made them both. And so we don't have to try to figure out. But why would it be a puzzle for an evolutionist? What would they need to think about to explain? Which came first? Did the shrimp start digging the hole first, or did the goby fish start? They've got to figure out who started helping whom first. And that gets you nowhere. It's a whole bunch of guesswork. It's a lot like which came first, the chicken or the egg. Yeah. Which, by the way, as a creationist, we know.
Chicken.
Yeah, God made a chicken. He didn't make an egg.
Have an egg.
Right. It would have gotten too cold. And it'd be silly to imagine God making baby Adam or even embryotic Adam. So why in the world would he make an embryotic chicken either? So for us, we know God made a mature universe, and he put in place wonderful things like symbiosis. And it's a lovely picture of how we as people work together, and we are designed to help each other. None of us are perfectly good at everything. God wanted us to need each other. So we don't have symbiosis in the Bible. We have other pictures like how a body helps itself out. But it is wonderful to see how God made these things to help each other.
Don't forget, you can find links to all the things we've talked about today by visiting the show notes page. creationscience4kids.com/time to let your friends know about this podcast and ministry.
And to connect with all the rest of the things we do with the podcast, stop by the web address I got just for you, cs4ks, the initials of the show.com, and find out how you can send us your own recording, write us an Apple Podcast review, drop us a note, become a monthly supporter, and see the heart of why this ministry is so important. Running this podcast and ministry isn't free, plus it takes a lot of time. We have a Patreon account where you can help us out, like Pastor Brian Betworth and the Academy of Christian Apologetics for Moms. Thank you. If just a few of our listeners help, even with just $1 a month, it will help cover the rest of our basic expenses, and anything above that will help us improve things for the future. Visit cs4ks.com to find out how you can get involved. Okay, now it's time for the joke. And this one is in a normal form, but I have actually heard people talk about this. So it's kind of been made generic, but this is very, very true and also still funny. A geologist once said that he must be 2.5 billion years old because in his youth, the age of the Earth was known to be 2 billion years. And now it is known to be 4.5 billion years.
That's funny.
Yeah, I've heard several of the older creationists. Now, they've kind of settled down on that 4.5 billion years. I don't think that's going to change much, not likely. But for quite a while, they were having to push everything back further and further as they were studying more and more, especially for evolution to not be something you just laugh at and throw out the window. They had to have more time. So they kept finding it.
Well, this finishes up our show for today. Have fun treasuring our amazing universe and Creator.
Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for thou hast created all things, and for thy pleasure they are and were created. Revelation 4:11.